Speaking of sleeping, a man told his physician that he was having difficulty with the problem of snoring. As soon as I go to sleep, the man said, I snore. What can I do to be cured? Well, does it bother your wife? The medical doctor asked. Oh, it not only bothers her, it disturbs the entire congregation. Well, I hope that you won't fall asleep today because we are part 3 of a 4-part series in the prophet Daniel. And part of the reason that we're doing this, a large part of the reason, is to get us prepared for this week's Vacation Bible School. That's what we'll be looking at. And so finding courage in challenging times is the theme for these 4 series. So the first Sunday in July, we talked about when things change, God is with us. When you need help, God is with us was last week, where we talked a little bit about Daniel interpreting dreams. Today, when you're afraid, God is with you. And of course, this is a story of the fiery furnace. We'll talk more about it. And then next Sunday, we'll conclude our series at the end of Vacation Bible School with a story of Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel chapter 3 is a well-known and well-loved chapter in the Bible. It contains everything that would be needed for a Netflix series. 90-foot idol, furious kings, fiery furnaces, hot enough to kill people who were just passing by. That sort of thing is easy to understand why that this was included in the design for a Vacation Bible School program, and especially appropriate as much of our nation sizzles with record high temperatures all across the nation. I want to help you hear this story again today, perhaps with new ears, maybe to glean some new learnings and some lessons for us as we go through times of trial in our lives. Because the theme for Wednesday and the middle of Vacation Bible School next week is, when you're afraid, God is with you. And that's going to be a call and response. So when you hear me say, when you're afraid, you will say, God is with you. Can I do it? When you're afraid. So let's begin with a little bit of background to our story to help us understand what's going on. Nebuchadnezzar has conquered God's people Israel and taken them back to Babylon. Daniel is one of these, but a story focuses on these 3, which Sandra had to repeat again and again. I don't know why the author couldn't have made it a little bit simpler. Just say the 3 men, but mentioned time and time again. Earlier in Daniel, we find that these 3 are all part of the king's staff. They had been educated, they were well trained, and so King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to surround himself with the very best that he had kind of imported from Israel, and among these were some Chaldeans, which we heard. And as Mike told us last week in our message, the king had had some disturbing dreams. So he asked the Chaldeans, he asked all of these wise people around him to interpret the dreams. But they said, well, we don't even know what you were dreaming, and so how could we know how to interpret it? So he is in a rage, and you see that again and again in the book of Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar. He's in a rage and ordered all of these advisors, all of these very wise men to be thrown into the furnace. But as it turns out, Daniel not only can interpret the dream, he knows what the dream is all about. He approaches the king and explains the dreams and how the answers that he got came from God. Once King Nebuchadnezzar understands the meaning of the dreams, he gets a good night's sleep. Sometimes that's all we need, right, is a nap. Give me some food when I'm gretzy. Give me some food and a nap, and I'll probably be better. So he returns to his senses. He's so grateful that he wants to promote Daniel. Daniel says, thank you, but promote my 3 friends. And this starts the kind of court intrigue. You see these Chaldeans, and like these imported Jews, these immigrants, if you will, brought there against their own will to get these favored positions, though it was these very 3 and Daniel that had saved these wise men's lives. So they waited and they plotted, and when the time came, Nebuchadnezzar built a golden idol in the province that these 3 men were ruling over. And of course, They were supposed to bow down. The Chaldeans couldn't wait to tell the king that these three refused to bow down to this 90-foot idol. So verse 1 of chapter 3 sets up the story for today. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue. It was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Can you imagine 90 feet high and 9 feet wide? He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He had big plans for it. He conveys his order. Anyone who does not bow down and worship will be immediately thrown into the furnace of fiery flames. Now, for those who lived in Babylon, that wasn't necessarily a big deal. But just like in the book of Revelation, where we read about the early Christians asked to bow down to the emperor, it certainly was for the people of God. It represented an idol, and that was strictly forbidden by the second of the Ten Commandments that we know from both Deuteronomy and Exodus 20. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow down or serve them. So they had a choice, either to be faithful or to relinquish their faith. So the first lesson, I think, in this is that they were faithful and true to God. When the king gathered together all of his officials to dedicate this golden image and fall down before it, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. They made the right choice, but they knew that their very lives would be in danger. The report comes to the king. There must have been a lot of competition between these officials to get ahead, and some saw it as a, quote, golden opportunity to get rid of the competition. If you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is a God who will deliver you out of my hands? Even with all these threats and the rage of the king, they remained faithful under pressure. They wouldn't bow down because they remembered this promise. When you are afraid, God is with you. Which brings us to the second lesson. They entrusted themselves into God's hands. There in the court, they were offered a second chance. They didn't bend. And that made Nebuchadnezzar even more angry. How dare they thwart his authority? And even though they were favored, they couldn't escape the king's anger. He had them thrown into the fiery furnace, but they didn't bow down and they didn't bend. They even told the king that God would save them, and even if for some reason God did not save them, it wouldn't change their love and their loyalty to their God. That did even more to stoke the king's anger. So he had the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. But they knew when you are afraid, which brings us to the third lesson. God was with them in their trials. It was so hot that it killed the men that were taking them there to place them in the fire. To everyone's surprise, when the king looked in the fiery furnace, they're still alive. They didn't bow, they didn't bend, and they didn't burn. Not only that, there was someone else with them, someone who had the appearance of a god. So the king is working on his basic math skills, and he's got a problem. He asks those around him, now weren't there just 3 men put into the fiery furnace? And now there is a 4th man there. Was it an angel, often called the Son of God, or was it the Son of God? All we know is that God sent one of his own to be with them in the midst of their trials. God did not let them go through it alone, but was with them in the fiery furnace, walking with them, assuring them, and protecting them. I love Johnny Cash. Anybody remember Johnny Cash? Has a song, The 4th Man in the Fire. That's where I got those 3. They didn't bow, they didn't bend, they didn't burn. If you want to ask how it goes, ask Gail, because I was singing it last night in the bathroom and showing her the YouTube video. And I said, We're going to talk about Johnny Cash and this song in this sermon tomorrow, so I'll ask her how it goes. So when they opened the door of the furnace, these men weren't harmed. Not their clothing, not their hair, not even their hair was singed. They didn't even smell like smoke. Now, a lot of us like to barbecue, and if you're using wood smoke, or if you have a campfire, right, Scott, you're going to probably get that smell on you, but they didn't even smell. They didn't bow, they didn't bend, they didn't burn. And when asked how, they gave a testimony to the God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed that he declared that if anyone anywhere would say anything against this God, they would be punished severely because there would be no other God that could do what this God had done. And in the end, he promoted these men. So where chapter 2 ends, chapter 3, after this long, difficult trial, ends with the same, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego promoted in verse 30. Now just let me give you some lessons for us, I think, from this, for our own lives. There's a little bit of background on the story and some lessons for our own life. I think spiritually, we are also in exile. The Bible talks about that in various ways, living in a foreign land. Peter calls Christians sojourners and exiles in this world. That's 1 Peter 2:10. The author of Hebrews talks about the saints as those who have acknowledged that they are strangers and exiles on earth. It's from chapter 11. I think we also, away from our heavenly home, live with various kinds of trials here on this earth. We are tested by fire, 1 Peter 1:7 says. And so when we go through those difficult times, which each of us have, and I look around the congregation, I see some of you who have had those very difficult trials in your life, you know that God has been with you. So to remember, first of all, to be true to God, just as these three men made the right choice and stuck with it, even with rage around them, they made the right choices. They wouldn't let the difficult circumstances of their life make them be untrue to God. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not grow weary in doing what is right." I love that passage. Let us not grow weary in doing what is right. In a time of testing, it's sometimes easy to grow weary and just to kind of give up. Curse God, Job's friends say, and die. But no, he wouldn't do it. James 1 says, "Blessed is the one who remains steadfast under trial." We are called to make the right choices, even when that's difficult, because we know the biblical truth, which is when you're afraid, Secondly, remember that to entrust ourselves into God's hands. Just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in full faith gave their lives over to God in the time of trial, we need to believe and trust that God will be with us as well. Hebrews 13:6 is a strong confession of faith. "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can others do to me?" The Lord is my helper. Whom shall I fear? What can others do to me? God will deliver us from our time of trial and bless us. And finally, to remember that God will be with us. Just as he was with these three, he will be with us. "I will never leave you nor forsake you," says Hebrews 13. Isaiah 43:2 says, "I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not consume you." 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your ability, so that with the testing he will also provide a way of escape that you can endure it." No matter what we face in our lives, the message is that we are not alone. God is with us. The issue isn't whether or not we'll be spared the flames or the fire of life, or whether God will keep us from suffering. That's really not suggested at all. Even Jesus himself says that we should expect to feel some heat. "In this world," he said, "you will have trouble." But fear not, I have overcome the world. The biblical faith is this: God doesn't promise to take us out of the flames or the fire of life. If I could promise that to people, these pews would be filled every week. There would be people waiting for multiple services because we would just be assured that nothing bad could ever happen. That's not what the promise is. The promise is God will be there with us, smack dab, in the middle of those challenges. There's no such thing as a fireproof life or even a fireproof faith. Accepting Christ doesn't give us some heavenly insurance policy, to keep us out of the heat below, as some people would say. But it gives us the promise that God's presence will be with us in no matter the circumstance. It really didn't matter to them whether or not they were saved by God or not in this story. Interesting. Even if God doesn't show up for us, we will still be faithful to God. They knew that they belonged to God. They knew that what Paul would write much later to the church at Rome, that there was nothing in life nor in death that could separate them from the love of God known to us as Christians in Christ Jesus. So, filled with that kind of faith, nothing would get in their way. No royal decree, no 90-foot idol, no king, no threat to freedom, not even a threat of death. They were faithful because God was faithful. And as Johnny Cash sings, there was a fourth man in that fire. And so when you feel like you've been thrown from the frying pan into the fire, I think is how the phrase goes, when you feel like life has caught you in the crossfire, when you feel like you are being baptized by fire, remember, when you're afraid. Yeah. Josh Wilson, I'm going to close with these words to a contemporary Christian song by Josh Wilson. I just love it. I was listening to the message the other day on Sirius XM radio on my car. And I'll conclude with this. When I'm shaking and my heart's pounding, you will always take me, make me lie down in peaceful fields where I can clear my head. Because I get so overcome with anxiety that there's an enemy living inside of me, like a mocker yelling out and telling lies to me. And I don't feel brave, and I don't have to be. Because I've walked through the valley of shadows, and it scared me half to death. But you're with me everywhere I go, so I won't give up yet. My fears would surely kill me if I didn't know the truth. The things that I'm afraid of are afraid of you. When my emotions turn against me, not faith nor reason could convince me that you have patience left to fight for me. And my depression has affected every ounce of me. I can get the medication and the counseling. Still, I hear the fear of calling out to me, and I don't feel brave enough. And I don't have to be. I've walked through the valley of the shadows, and it scared me half to death. But you're with me everywhere I go, so I won't give up yet. My fears would surely kill me if I didn't know the truth. The things that I'm afraid of are afraid of you. When I'm afraid,